June 6, 1944. Minutes after midnight. 3 Hawker gliders tear through the darkness over Nazi-occupied France. Inside the lead glider, 28 men of the 2nd Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry grip their weapons and brace for impact. They have trained for months, rehearsing on English bridges until every man knows his role by heart. The glider slams into the earth, skidding across a field and crashing through barbed wire before grinding to a halt just 47 yards from a small bridge spanning the Cain Canal. Within moments, soldiers are pouring from the shattered aircraft, sprinting toward the bridge that history will remember as Pegasus Bridge. German sentries barely have time to react. Gunfire erupts across the narrow span. Grenades explode near machine gun position. Within 10 minutes, British paratroopers have seized both the Cain Canal Bridge and a second bridge over the River Orne nearby. The eastern flank of the entire Normandy invasion now depends on holding these crossings until reinforcements arrive from the beaches. The German response comes faster than anyone expected. Radio messages flash to Wehrmacht headquarters. A panzer crew receives orders to retake the bridges at any cost, and now, in the darkness of those first chaotic hours of liberation, rumble of approaching armor echoes through the French countryside. The soldiers who seized Pegasus Bridge have rifles, grenades, and one weapon that many of them despise more than any other in the British arsenal. Sergeant Charles Thornton watches the German tank approach. The vehicle is a medium tank, its engine growling as it advances along the road toward the bridge with infantry walking alongside. In Thornton's hands sits what soldiers call the PIAT, the Projector Infantry Anti-Tank. It weighs over 32 pounds. It looks like a length of ugly plumbing pipe. Cocking it requires the strength of 2 men pulling against a spring that resists with 200 pounds of force. And its effective range against armor is so desperately short that using it essentially means accepting that you might die in the attempt. Thornton waits. The tank growls closer, its silhouette growing larger against the darkness. He has been trained to wait until the range closes to 50 yards or less, though even that distance might be too far. At 30 yards, close enough to see the faces of the German infantry illuminated by muzzle flashes, he fires. The shaped charge warhead strikes the tank and detonates. The explosion is not like a conventional blast. Instead, the precisely machined cone of copper inside the warhead liquefies instantly and transforms into a superheated jet traveling at thousands of feet per second. This jet punches through the tank's armor plate and ignites the ammunition stored inside. The vehicle erupts in a catastrophic fireball that illuminates the bridge and the surrounding countryside for hundreds of yards. Secondary detonations continue for nearly an hour as shells cook off inside the burning wreck. The fire blocks the road completely. A second German tank, unable to pass the inferno, retreats into the darkness. The bridge holds. The invasion's flank remains secure. Thornton later described the weapon that saved Pegasus Bridge with characteristic British understatement. He called it a load of rubbish and said that you are a dead loss if you try to go further than 50 yards, adding that even 50 yards is stretching it. He was not wrong. The PIAT was heavy, awkward, unreliable, and demanded suicidal courage from anyone who attempted to use it against enemy armor. And yet here is the paradox that military historians still struggle to explain. This weapon, which the British Ordnance Board had officially declared in 1941, would prove ineffective as an anti-tank weapon under any conceivable conditions of employment, would go on to destroy 7% of all German tanks knocked out by British forces in Normandy. That percentage exceeded the kill rate of aircraft rockets fired by Hawker Typhoon fighter bombers, the dedicated tank-hunting aircraft of the Allied air forces, which accounted for only 6% of German armor destroyed. More remarkably still, actions involving this supposedly useless weapon would earn 6 Victoria Crosses, Britain's highest award for valor, given only for acts of extraordinary courage in the face of the enemy. This is the story of how one of the ugliest, most despised weapons of the Second World War became one of its most effective, and how the men who carried it into battle performed feats of bravery that would become the stuff of legend. To understand why the PIAT existed at all, you must first understand the desperate crisis that forced its creation. By the spring of 1941, British infantry faced a terrifying reality on every battlefield where they encountered German armor. The standard anti-tank weapon issued to foot soldiers was the boys' anti-tank rifle, a massive .55 caliber weapon that looked impressive but had become functionally useless against modern German tanks. The boys' rifle had been adequate against the light tanks of the 1930s, but German armored vehicles had evolved rapidly during the first years of the war, adding thicker armor plating that the boys' rifle simply could not penetrate. During Operation Crusader in November 1941, British staff officers in North Africa conducted an exhaustive survey of tank engagements across the desert campaign. Their conclusion was devastating. After examining every available after-action report and interviewing survivors of armored encounters, they could not find a single confirmed instance of a boy's anti-tank rifle penetrating a German tank. The weapon's maximum armor penetration was just over 23 millimeters at 100 yards. This might have been sufficient against an armored car or a light reconnaissance vehicle, but it was utterly inadequate against even the side armor of a Panzer III, let alone the frontal armor of the heavier Panzer IV tanks that were becoming increasingly common. British infantrymen were essentially defenseless against enemy armor. When German tanks appeared, their only realistic options were to hide, run, or die. The situation was untenable. The army desperately needed a weapon that could actually stop a tank, that individual soldiers could carry into battle without vehicle support, and that could be manufactured quickly using Britain's already overstretched wartime industrial capacity. The Americans were developing their bazooka, but it was not yet available to British forces. The Germans had nothing comparable in service yet. British infantry needed a solution, and they needed it immediately. The answer came from one of the most eccentric inventors in British military history, and from a secret organization operating directly under the personal protection of Winston Churchill himself. Lieutenant Colonel Latham Valentine Stewart Blacker was not your typical weapons designer. Born in 1887, he had lived a life lifted from adventure fiction. He had served in Afghanistan, Turkestan, and Russia during his military career. In 1933, he participated in the Houston Mount Everest expedition, becoming one of the first people to fly over the world's highest peak, serving as observer and photographer in an aircraft piloted by Lord Clydesdale. Blacker was a genuine adventurer with an inventor's restless mind. Blacker had been working on spigot mortar designs since the early 1930s, pursuing an unconventional concept. Traditional weapons placed a projectile inside a barrel and used expanding gases to push it out. Blacker's design worked in reverse. The barrel, called a spigot, sat inside a hollow tube in the projectile. When fired, the spigot struck a propellant charge in the bomb's tail, launching it forward while recoil simultaneously pushed the spigot back. This arrangement had one crucial advantage for wartime Britain. It required no precision engineering. Conventional gun barrels needed exact tolerances, demanding specialized equipment in short supply. Blacker's design could be manufactured using simple pressed steel that any factory could produce. Blacker had already achieved success with his spigot concept. The Blacker Bombard, a larger version mounted on a heavy tripod, had been adopted by the Home Guard as an anti-tank weapon. In 1941, he developed a handheld version called the Baby Bombard, designed to give infantry a chance against enemy tanks. The weapon used a shaped charge warhead, a revolutionary advancement in anti-armor technology. Instead of relying on kinetic energy, the shaped charge used a precisely machined copper cone surrounded by explosive. When detonated, the force collapsed the cone into a superheated jet of molten metal that could burn through armor far thicker than any conventional projectile could penetrate. On paper, Blacker's Baby Bombard should have revolutionized infantry anti-tank warfare. The Ordnance Board, the official body responsible for evaluating and approving weapons for British military use, disagreed completely. Their experts examined Blacker's prototype, found numerous flaws. The weapon was heavy and awkward. The cocking procedure was exhausting. The range was dangerously short. The accuracy was questionable. On August 11th, 1941, they issued their verdict in the bureaucratic language that has killed countless promising ideas throughout military history. The Baby Bombard, they declared, would prove ineffective as an anti-tank weapon under any conceivable conditions of employment. Blacker was devastated by the rejection. He had spent years developing the concept, had proven the underlying principles with the Home Guard's Bombard, and believed passionately that his weapon could save British lives on the battlefield. But the official verdict was final. He was posted to other duties, and his prototype was consigned to a dusty corner, apparently destined for the scrap heap of failed wartime innovations. But the story was far from over. Major Milice Roland Jeffries commanded a unit so secret that even its name was classified. Officially designated MD-1, it was known informally as Churchill's toy shop because it operated under the Prime Minister's direct personal patronage. protected from the interference of conventional military bureaucracy by Winston Churchill's formidable influence. Jeffreys worked alongside Professor Frederick Lindemann, Churchill's chief scientific advisor, and General Hastings Ismay, the Prime Minister's chief military assistant. Together, they formed a trinity of unconventional warfare development that answered to no one except Churchill himself. MD-1 specialized in weapons that the regular military establishment considered too unusual, too risky, or simply too strange to pursue. During the war, they would be responsible for introducing 26 different devices into British service, ranging from limpet mines to sticky bombs to specialized demolition charges. Jeffreys was always hunting for promising ideas that had been rejected or overlooked by the conventional weapons establishment. Someone told him about Blacker's abandoned prototype. Jeffreys found the weapon, examined it carefully, and recognized immediately that beneath its obvious flaws lay a genuinely revolutionary concept. With Blacker's permission, he took the baby bombard apart piece by piece, analyzed every component, and set about redesigning the elements that did not work properly. He developed an improved shape charge bomb with better reliability and greater armor penetration. He refined the firing mechanism to improve consistency. He addressed the most critical problems while preserving the fundamental simplicity of Blacker's original concept. Jeffreys renamed the weapon the Jeffreys shoulder gun. Imperial Chemical Industries, the giant British chemical and manufacturing conglomerate, was brought in as the primary production contractor in January 1942. Their engineers worked with Jeffreys to combine the best features of both Blacker's original design and Jeffreys's improvements into a weapon that could actually be mass-produced. Production began in August 1942, and the weapon received its official designation, the projector, infantry, anti-tank, and Mark I. The acronym PIAT entered the vocabulary of every British and Commonwealth soldier who would carry the ugly pipe into battle over the next decade. The first production order called for 100,000 launchers and 5 million rounds of ammunition. As the war progressed and the weapon proved itself in combat, these numbers grew enormously. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, British factories had manufactured 115,000 PIAT launchers. The total ammunition requirement had been increased to over 13 million rounds, far exceeding anyone's initial projection. The weapon that the experts had declared useless under any conceivable condition was about to prove them spectacularly, repeatedly, and heroically wrong. To understand what PIAT operators faced in combat, you must first understand the physical reality of operating the weapon. The PIAT measured 39 inches in overall length, roughly the same as a short walking stick, but there any resemblance to familiar objects ended. The launcher weighed over 32 pounds empty and felt heavier because the weight was distributed unevenly along its awkward tubular body. Adding a 2.5-pound bomb brought the total weight to nearly 35 pounds that a soldier had to carry. In addition to his rifle, ammunition, pack, and all the other equipment infantry were expected to haul into battle. Before the PIAT could be fired, it had to be cocked, and this was where the weapon's fearsome reputation truly began. The firing mechanism relied on a massive steel spring that required approximately 200 pounds of force to compress. The official technique demanded that the soldier place the weapon on its butt with the shoulder pad facing upward, then stand on the shoulder pad as if mounting an oversized pogo stick, keeping his feet planted on the pad. He would grip the body of the launcher and pull upward with all his strength, using his leg muscles to assist his arms in fighting against the spring's resistance. The motion required significant height and strength. Soldiers under 5 feet 7 inches tall often could not extend far enough to complete the cocking procedure, lacking the leverage necessary to compress the spring fully. Even taller, stronger men found the process exhausting, especially after the physical demands of combat movement. Attempting to cock a PIAT while lying prone, which might be necessary if a soldier needed to recock after a misfire, while under enemy observation, was described by veterans as akin to making violent love to the weapon. The 1943 training manual noted with characteristic British understatement that in action, the projector will always be carried cocked, tacitly acknowledging that attempting to cock the weapon while under enemy fire would be tantamount to suicide. The bomb itself contained a shape-charged warhead with a diameter of approximately 89 millimeters surrounded by high explosive. When the trigger was pulled, the massive spring hurled the steel spigot forward at approximately 25 feet per second. The spigot entered the hollow tail tube of the bomb and struck a propellant cartridge containing 52 grains of cordite. This small explosive charge launched the bomb forward at roughly 270 feet per second, while simultaneously driving the spigot backward against its spring, theoretically recocking the weapon automatically for the next shot. The theoretical armor penetration was impressive, approximately 100 millimeters of steel plate, enough to defeat any German tank if the shot struck the side or rear armor at a perpendicular angle. The effective range against armored targets was listed officially at 115 yards. Maximum range when used as an indirect fire mortar against buildings or fortifications was 350 yards. In practice, however, these figures were optimistic. The practical effective range for engaging tanks was far shorter. Experienced operators knew that hitting a moving target at 100 yards was largely a matter of luck. 50 yards was more realistic. 30 yards was better. The closer you got, the higher your chances of actually hitting the tank and having the bomb function properly. But getting close to an enemy tank meant exposing yourself to machine gun fire to the main gun. If the crew spotted you, and to the infantry that typically accompanied armored vehicles, using a PIAT effectively was not merely difficult. It was an act requiring extraordinary personal courage. The first combat test came on July 10, 1943, when Canadian troops of the 1st Canadian Infantry Division carried PIATs ashore during Operation Husky, the Allied invasion of Sicily. The debut was problematic. In the first engagements against enemy armor, 3 tanks were attacked and all 3 bombs failed to function properly. The projectiles bounced off the target vehicles without detonating because the fuse mechanism only worked when the bomb struck armor at close to a perpendicular angle. Glancing hits at oblique angles produced no effect. 9 days later, Canadian troops achieved better results, destroying 3 tanks, a tank transporter, and 3 trucks. But the overall early performance suggested that approximately 25% of bombs were failing to detonate properly, an alarming rate that prompted urgent redesigns of the ammunition fuse. Despite these early problems, the PIAT gradually earned the trust of the soldiers who carried it. Unlike the bazooka or the Panzerfaust, it produced no dangerous backblast when fired. A soldier could shoot from inside a building, from a cellar window, from an upstairs room, without the rocket exhaust injuring or killing everyone behind him. This capability proved crucial in urban combat, where fighting from buildings was often the only way to survive against enemy armor. The PIAT also generated minimal smoke signature compared to rocket weapons. A bazooka or Panzerfaust announced the firer's position with an unmistakable cloud of exhaust, inviting immediate retaliation. The PIAT's spigot mechanism produced only a small flash and relatively little smoke, making it harder for enemies to identify and target the soldier who had just fired at their tank. These advantages partially offset the weapon's severe limitations, but only if the operator had the courage to exploit them. Getting close enough to use the PIAT effectively meant crawling toward a 40-ton steel monster that could kill you with its machine guns, with its main cannon, with its tracks, with the infantry walking beside it. The men who did this regularly, who faced German tanks at ranges measured in feet rather than yards, demonstrated a kind of courage that their nations would recognize with the highest honors available. The first Victoria Cross earned with the PIAT went to Fusilier Francis Arthur Jefferson of the 2nd Battalion, Lancashire Fusiliers. On May 16, 1944, Jefferson's company was defending a position along the Gustav Line near Monte Cassino, Italy. The fighting around Cassino had already consumed thousands of Allied lives in one of the most brutal campaigns of the entire war. German forces had fortified every hill, every building, and every inch of ground with their typical thoroughness, and breaking through required constant assault against prepared positions. That day, German armor counterattacked against the British positions. A PIAT team was caught in the open by enemy fire and killed, their weapon lying abandoned where they had fallen. Jefferson saw enemy tanks approaching his company's positions, threatening to break through the defensive line and roll up the entire battalion. Without orders, without hesitation, he grabbed the fallen PIAT and ran forward alone toward the approaching armor. The lead German tank was only 20 yards away when Jefferson stood up in the open, exposed to enemy fire from the tank's machine guns and from the infantry supporting it. At that range, he could see individual details on the tank's armor plating. He could probably see the faces of the crewmen through their vision ports. He aimed the PIAT and fired. His bomb struck true. The shaped charge jet burned through the armor and ignited something vital inside. The tank burst into flames and all its crew were killed. Jefferson immediately turned toward a second tank that was approaching behind the first. He advanced toward it, but the second crew, having just watched their comrades burn to death, chose discretion over valor and withdrew before Jefferson could get within range. Jefferson's one-man assault stopped the German counterattack cold and saved his company from being overrun. He was awarded the Victoria Cross for his actions, one of only 182 awarded during the entire Second World War. Jefferson survived the war, was demobilized in July 1946, and lived until September 4th, 1982, when he died in Bolton, Lancashire, at the age of 61. 3 weeks after Jefferson's action in Italy, Company Sergeant Major Stanley Hollis of the 6th Battalion, Green Howards, earned what remains the only Victoria Cross awarded for actions on D-Day itself. Of all the thousands of acts of bravery performed during the Normandy landings, only one was recognized with Britain's highest honor, and Stanley Hollis performed not one but to separate acts of extraordinary valor on June 6, 1944. During the first action, Hollis assaulted 2 German pillboxes that were holding up the advance near Montfleury, charging them with a Sten gun and grenades, while his men provided covering fire. He killed or captured over 2 dozen enemy soldiers and cleared the way for his battalion to move inland from the beaches. The second action came later that day near the village of Crépon. A German field gun that had been bypassed during the initial advance opened fire on Hollis's company from a concealed position, threatening to cause serious casualties among troops who thought they had already cleared the area. Hollis assessed the situation, grabbed a PIAT, and pushed forward through enemy-held territory to a house just 50 yards from the German gun emplacement. From that dangerously close range, he engaged the enemy position with the PIAT. A German sniper spotted him during the assault and fired, the bullet grazing his right cheek and leaving a wound that would scar him for life. Despite the injury, Hollis successfully destroyed the enemy gun and then used a gun to provide covering fire, while his men withdrew from their exposed position. Hollis was recommended for the Victoria Cross by his commanding officer, who noted that throughout the day he displayed the utmost gallantry and that, on 2 separate occasions, his courage and initiative prevented the gruesome casualties which would have occurred had he not taken immediate action. He survived the war, though he was wounded again before the fighting ended, and returned to civilian life in Yorkshire. He died on February 8, 1972, at the age of 59. His Victoria Cross was later purchased by Sir Ernest Harrison OB and donated to the Green Howards Museum in Richmond, where it remains on display today. 6 days after D-Day, on June 12, 1944, the war on the other side of the world produced another PIAT, Victoria Cross, under circumstances that strained the boundaries of believability. Rifleman Ganju Lama of the 1st Battalion, 7th Duke of Edinburgh's own Gurkha Rifles, faced Japanese tanks during the Battle of Imphal, fighting near the village of Ningt Haokong in one of the most critical engagements of the entire Burma campaign. What makes Ganju Lama's actions almost impossible to comprehend is that he accomplished them while suffering from wounds that would have incapacitated most soldiers entirely. He had a broken left wrist, he had a wound to his right hand, he had a wound to his leg. His ability to even hold a weapon, let alone aim and fire it accurately, should have been severely compromised, if not eliminated entirely. But Ganju Lama was not most soldiers. When Japanese tanks threatened to break through the Gurkha positions, Ganju Lama crawled forward through thick mud under heavy crossfire, dragging his PIAT with him. He moved through ground that was swept by enemy machine gun fire, where raising your head meant death. He crawled until he reached a position just 30 yards from the Japanese tanks, close enough to see the rising sun emblems painted on their turrets, close enough to hear the crews shouting commands inside. Lying in the open, barely able to grip his weapon with his shattered hands, Ganju Lama took aim at the first tank and fired. The PIAT bomb struck home and the vehicle was knocked out. He reloaded the weapon, a process that would have been agonizing with his injuries, and engaged the second tank. It too was destroyed. Still not finished, he crawled forward and engaged the fleeing tank crews with grenades, denying them the opportunity to escape and fight again another day. Ganju Lama's one-man assault stopped the Japanese armored attack and preserved the Gurkha positions at a critical moment in the battle. His real name was Gyamtso Shangdepa, Name Ganju Lama, apparently resulting from a clerical error when he enlisted. He was not ethnically Gurkha but rather Sikh, making his service with one of the most famous fighting regiments in the world all the more remarkable. He had already earned a military medal for destroying 2 other Japanese tanks during fighting on the Tidim Road in May of that year, demonstrate that his extraordinary courage at Ningtaohong was not a single isolated incident but rather a consistent pattern of heroism. Ganju Lama survived the war and received his Victoria Cross from Lord Wavell, the Viceroy of India. He lived until June 30th, 2000, dying in Gangtok, Sikkim, at the age of 76. His Victoria Cross is displayed at the Gurkha Museum in Winchester. If you are finding this story of courage and sacrifice compelling, please consider subscribing to the channel. The most sustained PIAT action of the entire war occurred during Operation Market Garden in September 1944. Major Robert Cain of the 2nd Battalion, South Staffordshire Regiment, found himself defending the village of Oosterbeek as German forces attempted to annihilate the British airborne perimeter near Arnhem. What followed over the next 6 days was perhaps the most remarkable individual display of anti-armor combat in British military history. Market Garden was supposed to end the war by Christmas. Allied airborne forces would seize a series of bridges across the Netherlands, opening a corridor for armored units to drive into the heart of Germany. The plan depended on speed and surprise. It achieved neither. German forces responded far more quickly and powerfully than Allied intelligence had predicted, and the British 1st Airborne Division found itself surrounded and outnumbered at Arnhem, fighting desperately to hold until relief forces could break through. Cain's battalion was defending the perimeter at Oosterbeek when German armor began probing the British positions. Over the 6 days from September 19th to the 25th, Cain personally engaged enemy tanks and self-propelled guns with PIATs whenever they approached his sector. He destroyed approximately 6 tanks and an unknown number of self-propelled guns, often firing at ranges so close that the blast from his own weapons scorched his uniform. On September 21st, a PIAT bomb detonated prematurely just after leaving the launcher. The explosion blew Cain off his feet and left him temporarily blind, his face blackened and peppered with metal fragments from the bomb casing. His sight returned after approximately half an hour, but the injury would have justified immediate evacuation to medical facilities behind the lines. Cain refused to leave, half blind, in pain, his face a mask of burns and embedded shrapnel, and he continued to direct his men and engage enemy armor whenever it threatened his positions. The German forces attacking Oosterbeek included some of the heaviest and most formidable tanks in the Wehrmacht's inventory. Tiger II tanks, also known as King Tigers, from the 506th Heavy Tank Battalion arrived at Oosterbeek on September 5th. These 70-ton monsters carried armor so thick that most Allied anti-tank weapons simply bounced off. Yet the lightly armed British paratroopers, equipped with nothing heavier than PIATs and a few anti-tank guns, continued to fight. 5 Victoria Crosses were awarded for actions during the Battle of Arnhem. 4 of those recipients died earning them. Lieutenant John Greyburn was killed on September 20th. Flight Lieutenant David Lord died when his aircraft was shot down on September 19th. Lance Sergeant John Baskerville was killed manning an anti-tank gun on September 20th. Captain Lionel Queripel was killed covering his men's withdrawal on September 19th. Robert Cain was the only Arnhem Victoria Cross recipient to survive the battle. Cain escaped across the Rhine with the remnants of the 1st Airborne Division during Operation Berlin, the evacuation that ended the Arnhem disaster. He survived the war and returned to civilian life, working in the insurance industry. He died on May 2nd, 1974. His daughter Frances would later marry the actor Jeremy Clarkson, ensuring that Cain's story would occasionally resurface unexpected contexts. 1 month after Arnhem, on the night of October 21st through 22nd, 1944, Private Ernest Alvia Smith of the Seaforth Highlanders of Canada earned his Victoria Cross at the River Savio in Italy. Known throughout his unit by his nickname Smokey, Smith would become the only Canadian private to receive the Victoria Cross during the entire Second World War. The Canadian forces had established a bridgehead on the east bank of the Savio, a critical river crossing that would allow the Allied advance to continue. German forces recognized the threat and launched a determined counterattack to eliminate the bridgehead before it could be reinforced. A troop of 3 Panther tanks, supported by 2 self-propelled guns, advanced toward the Canadian position. Their firepower overwhelming compared to the infantry weapons available to the defenders. Smith led his PIAT team across open ground toward the approaching German armor. The distance to cover was swept by enemy fire. Any soldier caught in the open would be cut down within seconds. Smith reached a position within 30 feet of the lead Panther tank, close enough to count the length in its tracks, close enough that he could probably feel the heat radiating from its engine. He fired his PIAT and destroyed the tank with a single shot. But the battle was not over. German infantry, who had been advancing with the tanks, now charged toward Smith's position, determined to overwhelm the Canadian soldier who had just killed their armored support. Smith dropped his empty PIAT, grabbed his Thompson submachine gun, and opened fire. He killed 4 German soldiers and drove the remainder back, holding his position single-handedly against an enemy counterattack. Smith's actions prevented the Germans from overrunning the bridgehead and potentially destroying the entire Canadian position on the east bank of the Savio. He was awarded the Victoria Cross for extraordinary courage that went beyond what any soldier could reasonably be expected to demonstrate. Smoky Smith became something of a celebrity in Canada after the war, known for his irreverent sense of humor and his willingness to share his story with younger generations. He became the last living Canadian Victoria Cross recipient in 2000. When Ernest Chicken, another Second World War veteran, died, Smith himself died on August 3, 2005, ending a remarkable life that had taken him from the desperate fighting of the Italian campaign to decades of service as a living reminder of Canadian military valor. The 6th and final PIAT Victoria Cross was awarded to Captain John Henry Count Brunt of the 6th Battalion, Lincolnshire Regiment, for actions on December 9, 1944, near the Italian city of Faenza. The circumstances of his award are among the most tragic of any Victoria Cross recipient of the war, not because of what he did but because of what happened afterward. Brunt's position came under attack by 3 German Mark IV tanks supported by infantry that outnumbered his small force by at least 3-1. Any reasonable commander might have ordered an immediate withdrawal to avoid being overrun and destroyed. Brunt chose to fight. He personally manned a Bren gun and engaged the attacking enemy infantry, killing approximately 14 German soldiers with accurate sustained fire. When the infantry assault faltered under his withering fire, he directed his men operating a PIAT, a 2-inch mortar, to engage the supporting tanks, denying them the ability to close with his position. He then organized a fighting withdrawal that preserved his unit while inflicting maximum casualties on the enemy. Brunt's tactical skill and personal courage prevented what could have been a disaster. His men survived. The German attack was repulsed. He was recommended for the Victoria Cross by his commanding officers, who recognized that his actions exemplified everything the medal was meant to honor. John Brunt never received his Victoria Cross. The day after his heroic action, on December 10, 1944, he was standing in a doorway, having a mug of tea, when a stray German mortar bomb landed at his feet and killed him instantly. He was 22 years old and 4 days, having been born on December 6, 1922. His Victoria Cross was presented posthumously to his family, and the medal is now displayed at the Museum of Lincolnshire Life in Lincoln. The PIAT's success defied every prediction the weapons experts had made. The 7% of German tanks it destroyed in Normandy exceeded the kill rate achieved by the Hawker Typhoon's rockets, which accounted for only 6% enemy armor knocked out. A survey conducted in 1944 and 45 asked 161 Canadian Army officers to identify the most effective weapons they had encountered in combat. The PIAT was rated the single most outstandingly effective weapon in the entire infantry arsenal, ranking above even the beloved Bren gun that Canadian soldiers carried throughout the war. How did a weapon so obviously flawed achieve such remarkable results? Part of the answer lies in the terrain where many of the critical battles were fought. In the hedgerow country of Normandy, called the bocage by the French farmers who had shaped it over centuries, fields were small and enclosed by dense vegetation that limited visibility to 50 or 60 yards at most. The PIAT's short range mattered far less when no one could see farther anyway. At Arnhem and Oosterbeek, the urban environment of villages and city blocks created similar conditions. The narrow streets were often shorter than the PIAT's official effective range, which meant that operators could engage enemy armor at distances where their weapons were genuinely effective. The same pattern repeated in the villages and towns of Italy, where buildings channeled combat into close-range engagements that favored the PIAT's capabilities. But terrain alone does not explain the weapon's success. The PIAT worked because extraordinarily brave men made it work. They crawled close enough to enemy tanks to smell the exhaust fumes. They stood up in the open while machine guns swept their position. They accepted wounds that would have incapacitated lesser soldiers and continued fighting until the enemy was destroyed or driven off. The PIAT gave infantry a fighting chance against armor, but only if the infantryman had the courage to use that chance. Compared to its German and American counterparts, the PIAT occupied a unique position in the arsenal of anti-tank weapons. The German Panzerfaust was lighter, approximately 6 kilograms for the Panzerfaust 60 model, and achieved greater armor penetration at roughly 140 millimeters. However, it was a single-shot disposable weapon that produced a massive backblast danger to anyone standing behind the firer, making it unusable from enclosed spaces. The American M1 bazooka weighed about 13 pounds, roughly half the PIAT's burden, and offered greater effective range at approximately 250 yards. Its armor penetration with improved ammunition reached 102 millimeters, slightly better than the PIAT's theoretical maximum. But like the Panzerfaust, it produced a dangerous backblast that limited where and how it could be fired. The PIAT's ability to fire from inside buildings without killing the firer's comrades proved crucial in urban combat. At Arnhem, British paratroopers defending houses against German armor could engage tanks from upper windows, from cellars, from any position that offered a clear shot, without worrying about the exhaust blast that would have made rocket weapons suicidal in similar circumstances. George MacDonald Fraser, the author best known for his Flashman novels, served with the 9th Battalion, Border Regiment in Burma during 1944 and 45. His memoir, Quartered Safe Out Here, remains one of the finest accounts of infantry combat written by any participant in the Second World War. After the war, some military historians claimed that the PIAT was rarely or never used in the Far East theater, suggesting that the weapon's success was limited to European conditions. Fraser responded with characteristic directness. He wrote that he had carried the bloody thing and fired it 5 times with startling results. He described using the weapon to sink a Japanese riverboat during operations in Burma, demonstrating that the PIAT served effectively wherever British and Commonwealth troops fought. From the Mediterranean to the jungles of Southeast Asia, the PIAT remained in British service until the early 1950s, seeing action during the Korean War, where Commonwealth forces once again faced enemy armor. Some nations continued using the weapon even longer, with Indian forces reportedly employing PIATs as late as 1971 during the war with Pakistan. The design that experts had dismissed as useless under any conceivable condition served for nearly 3 decades beyond its expected lifespan. Lieutenant Colonel Stewart Blacker, the eccentric adventurer whose baby bombard prototype had been rejected so contemptuously in August 1941, received £25,000 from the Royal Commission on Awards to Inventors, with an additional £7,000 awarded later, totaling £32,000 in recognition of his contribution to the war effort. He died on April 19, 1964, having lived long enough to see his despised invention vindicated by history. Major Millis Jeffries, who had rescued the design from obscurity and transformed it into a practical weapon, rose to the rank of Major General and received a knighthood for his services. MD1, Churchill's toy shop, was disbanded after the war, its missions accomplished and its secrets only gradually emerging. In the decades that followed, as official documents were declassified and participants published their memoirs, original PIAT launchers now reside in military museums around the world, including the Imperial War Museum in London, the Canadian War Museum in Ottawa, and regimental collections throughout the Commonwealth. They look exactly as the soldiers who carried them described: ugly, awkward, and thoroughly uninspiring. Nothing about their battered steel tubes suggests the history they helped make possible. And yet, these simple weapons represent something profound about the nature of war and the soldiers who fight it. The most sophisticated weapon ever designed is useless without someone willing to carry it forward and use it against the enemy. The crudest, most primitive weapon can change the course of history in the hands of the right soldier at the right moment. The The PIAT worked not because of its design, which was genuinely flawed in numerous ways, but because the men who carried it refused to accept that they were helpless against enemy armor. They found ways to make it work. They learned its quirks and compensated for its weaknesses. They got close enough to their targets that the range limitations became irrelevant. They accepted the risks and paid the price when the odds went against them. 6 Victoria Crosses tell that story in the most eloquent terms possible. 6 men who saw tanks approaching and chose to fight instead of flee. 6 moments when individual courage outweighed apparently impossible odds. Francis Jefferson, standing alone in the open at Monte Cassino, facing down German armor with a weapon that required him to stand within 20 yards of his target. Stanley Hollis advancing on a German gun position at Crepon with a sniper's bullet grazing his face, refusing to stop until the enemy was destroyed. Gunju Lama crawling through the mud at Imphal with shattered hands, destroyed. Japanese tanks through pure determination when he could barely hold his weapon. Robert Cain fighting half-blind at Oosterbeek, refusing evacuation despite wounds that would have justified it, engaging enemy armor for 6 consecutive days until the order finally came to withdraw. Ernest Smith destroying a Panther tank at 30 feet and then holding off German infantry with his Tommy gun, defending his position alone against overwhelming odds. John Brunt rallying his men against 3-to-1 odds, killing 14 enemy soldiers personally before organizing the withdrawal that saved his command, then dying from a random mortar bomb the very next day, never knowing that he would receive his nation's highest honor. The British Ordnance Board declared in August 1941 that the PIAT would prove ineffective as an anti-tank weapon under any conceivable conditions of employment. They were experts. They had examined the weapon carefully. They had applied their professional judgment to assess its capabilities, and they were wrong. They could not conceive of the conditions these 6 men would create through their own actions. Conditions defined not by mechanical specifications or engineering tolerances, but by human will and human courage. The experts measured the weapon's range, weight, penetration, and accuracy. They forgot to measure the hearts of the soldiers who would carry it into battle. That ugly pipe earned 6 Victoria Crosses not despite its flaws, but in some ways because of them. Its severe limitations demanded that soldiers approach enemy tanks at suicidal ranges where only extraordinary bravery would suffice. The PIAT did not make heroes. It revealed them. It identified the soldiers who possessed courage beyond what any reasonable person could expect, and it gave them the means to express that courage in actions that would echo through history. The most hated weapon in the British arsenal became one of its most effective. The weapon that experts declared useless destroyed more tanks than aircraft rockets. The simple steel tube that soldiers cursed and complained about earned 6 Victoria Crosses, more than almost any other individual weapon system of the entire war. Because in the end, weapons do not win wars. Soldiers win wars. And the soldiers who carried the PIAT, who accepted its weight and its limitation and its dangers, who crawled close enough to enemy tanks to see their own deaths reflected in the armor plating, those soldiers prove that courage will always matter more than engineering specification. The British Ordnance Board measured the PIAT and found it wanting. They should have measured the men who would use it instead.